Water will just come in and it'll fill our well, and then we have pumps that pump the water from there, and it goes through some chemicals. Then it gets what we call a coagulant, and what coagulant does is it takes it puts a charge in the water, and all the dirt particles, they come together like a snowball. You know, you roll a snowball and it just gets bigger. Kind of like that, the chemicals cause the dirt particles to come together and they form heavier balls of dirt, and then they settle out in the settling basins, which is behind the building here, and then that takes like a few hours. Then it goes through what we call the filters, and that's the final step. It goes through, it gets filtered, and then at the bottom of the filters is pretty much drinkable. So all the dirt settles out, goes through, gets filtered, kind of like a pool filter. You know, a sand filter, go through the filter and comes out clean. And then we add chlorine to it, we add fluoride to it, and then it goes right up through and right up the hill and into the tower. You guys all know where the tower is? Okay, it goes up there and that's it. The plant is, we were just talking about this morning, the plant's 86 years old. That's a long time. But when they built this plant, they knew what they were doing. Back then, they knew how to put things together.
So the pipe that's 1,400 feet out, how big is that pipe that's bringing the raw water in?
It's 18 inches in diameter. So it's about a foot and a half in diameter. We're bringing it right now at a rate, the flow rate right now through there is about 238,000, or 23800 a minute. I'm sorry, 238 a minute, gallons per minute. So if you can imagine, that's a lot of water.
Yeah.
So.
Where's the entrance point out there? Is it far?
You mean as far as the intake?
Yeah, the intake.
Well, if you see that white building out there,
Yep.
it's about 1,400 feet out into the lake from that point. So it's northwest of that, northwest in the lake about that far, which is pretty far.
Yeah, that's cool.
And it actually, when it hits there, it kind of makes a bend and it kind of goes right, like down by the river here, and it actually crosses the river. And I don't know if you guys ever heard the story about, you probably have, Zach, where the anchor went through the intake. Somehow an anchor it dropped off somehow, and it went in, and it busted the intake, and it actually went into the intake. So they had to repair that. It would take a lot to freeze that water that's down below, about, I think it's like 15, 20 feet below the surface. So it would take a lot. They have what they call frazzle ice, that when water gets really super cold, it'll start to build up like ice and slush. And sometimes that will affect an intake where it'll partially plug it, and they got to go out there either remove it by a diver, or they have a way of bringing water back through the pipe and you can bust that off. At this plant, we have a pump house down at the river, and it has a big pump in it. And we can turn that pump on, it'll send water back towards the intake, and it'll literally bust that off. And we've had to do that a couple times, I think.
So does the pipe that runs out there, how often does that get tested to make sure that it's working properly?
Twice a year, generally. We have a man named Pat Murphy. He works with the diving. He's a diver, actually goes out there, and he'll dive down there and he'll check the zebra mussels. Have you guys ever heard of that? Those are like little snails that actually can come together and they can block off an intake, and it can restrict your water. So he goes out and inspects that, and he'll also just check the overall, to see if the intake is compromised in any way, and then he gives the report to us, and then we go with that, see what we have to do.
Just out of curiosity, who pays for that?
That's through the administration. Yeah. So I'll show you the first floor, the raw well, where I was talking about where the water goes in. And then I'll show you the chlorine room and the filters and the lab, where we do a lot of the testing in the lab, which, by the way, we also test the water every couple hours to make sure the water's good and it's drinkable and the standards, so that when you drink it, it's going to be safe. And we also have to watch the pressures, because firefighters need the pressure. So we got to maintain a good pressure. But yeah, if you guys want to come in.
Let's go.
And the reason it's blue is obvious because blue, clean, clean blue water. There's some pipes down there that are brown, and that just shows that that's like dirty water. Okay. Here, I'll show you guys the raw well.
Smells like a pool.
Watch your step on this. That'll take your shin out right there. And right below us is the well. All the water from the lake comes in and fills these wells. And here we're actually kind of adding activated carbon. And what activated carbon does is it absorbs the algae. Have you guys ever heard of the algae that's out there in the lake? You know, that every now and then they'll post like a beach advisory, you know, about algae warning. Well, we have an algae now. It's a microcystin, and it's a toxic algae. And one of the biggest things we can do to get rid of that algae is carbon. And you know, carbon, if you put carbon with water, it'll suck up the water. It does the same with algae. It's actually the biggest tool that we have right now to fight algae. It absorbs the algae, okay? And then as it gets pumped out of the well into the basins, that coagulant that I told you about is a chemical that makes it all come together and form big particles. Well, it takes the algae, that harmful algae, and it helps it settle out into the basins where we can get rid of it. And then once it's in there, all the clear water goes into the rest of the system, and that'll get filtered. So you're actually settling the water out, then you're filtering it. Then by the time it goes to the filters, it's actually clean enough to drink. So we have that overhead crane that lifts. There's a screen right here that if we get any kind of fish or anything like that, that'll actually screen out the fish. So it comes in this half, goes through the screens, and it goes in there. And then the suction pipes for the raw pumps are actually in there.
What's this copper weight?
Oh, that copper, that's where we get our sample. When we take, that's a good question. I'm glad you asked that.
Yeah, what are you doing now?
What we do is we sample each part of the process to make sure that, okay, that one there will tell us the condition of the water before treatment, okay? Then we have other sampling areas where it tells us, okay, mid-treatment, are we getting enough dirt out of the water? What our chemicals are the chemicals where they need to be? Because they could, you know, if you overfeed chemicals, that's not good. If you underfeed, it's not good. You have to be right where you need to be. So that one there, it actually tells us what is the condition of this water right here. And that tells us, do we need to add more coagulant because the water's getting really dirty? And temperature can play a lot with treatment. Temperature can say, well, some chemicals have a working point with, you know, they work best at a certain temperature. Well, if the water gets super cold, we'll have to adjust the chemical to make it more potent so that it'll do its job. Do you guys have any questions about?
How often does a fish actually get caught in here?
Certain seasons, I think, like I've seen it in the spring and in the fall, not so much in the summer. I don't know why. Maybe it has to do with a lot of ways the fish will have young fish out there by the intake. You might have like groups where they'll move in. I think it was this spring we had you could actually see them, the minnows in there. You could actually see minnows floating in there, swimming around in there. I haven't seen anything too much bigger than maybe that big. Yeah.
So how many gallons a day do you guys treat?
A day, I'm thinking 250,000 a day, somewhere in there, 300,000. Right now we're getting right around the higher amount because everybody's using water. But in the wintertime we're down quite a bit.
And how many gallons does the water tower on Orchard Street hold?
That's 200,000, I believe. Yeah, 200,000.
And that gets filled up every night?
Yeah. Oh yeah, it gets filled up every night. And then in the morning, everybody the tank starts dropping. So then we come in and we start filling the tank up as it's dropping. So you got everybody using the water, and we're filling it up at the same time there, and it gets introduced to the water so it can disinfect the germs in the water, the bacteria, and all that. And we have to we have to keep that area there under a lot of care, because chlorine gas could take your life, you know. So we have to be really careful. You have to have that door shut all the time, and then of course this will show you a little bit. Chlorine, it gets through here, interacts with the water, and it'll actually make the water through this pipe. It'll be a little bit like, almost like an amber color. Chlorine gas is like an amber color, so when it goes in, it'll mix, and by the time it's filtered out, it'll be clear. So that's actually good, because you know that we're actually feeding it. And then downstairs, we have chlorine. We have chlorine introduction point. We have all the chemicals. We have the coagulant that we feed. We have a chemical called zinc orthophosphate, and then what that does is it lines the plumbing out in the system, so you don't get copper. You know, your copper doesn't go up or your lead doesn't go up. It kind of coats all your plumbing, so you don't get any kind of copper or any kind of lead and copper. So we feed that down here, and I'll show you upstairs real quick. That's left over. It goes through the tops of these filters right where we are. It goes through sand and gravel. It cleanses the water, and it goes down into that clear well I was telling you about, kind of like a big pool filter. It'll filter all the fines out of the water, and it goes through here. And we only have 2 filters on at a time. What's your name? Manuel. He mentioned this water that's coming out. That's actually one of those sample points again, okay? And that sample there is actually the water that is finished. So we can take that water in there, we can say, okay, this is the water coming in. It's going through all phases of treatment, and then we take water from there and we test it, and we say, oh, okay, good, we're right where we need to be. So that water there is really what tells us, are we where we need to be? Do we need to adjust chemicals? You know, that kind of thing. We write every day. Every day we put in a report what our findings are every day. Actually, all that is, one day is comprised of every 2 hours. So every 2 hours we write our results down. We put it all in a sheet. And then at the end of the day, we take that sheet and we give them the numbers per day, and every day of the month and every month of the year. So it's like they're not here physically, but they're here by paperwork. They monitor everything.
So how often is somebody in this building?
6 a.m. till about 6:30 p.m. 6:30 p.m. usually the operator will be done. System will be full. He has to make sure the system's full, so through the course of the night, there'll be enough in that water tower to supply the needs of all the people that drink it.
And then is that over the weekend too?
Yes, every day, 7 days a week. Yep. Yeah, I wouldn't. If there was one day where an operator wasn't here, it wouldn't be good. We'd run out of water out there. In the morning when we come in at 6 a.m., it's right around 13 feet. Okay, so by the end of the day, it's at 27 feet. So that's how much we put in during the day on top of what people drink and use for their personal needs. And fires, of course, but if something would happen, say there was a big fire up there and we drew a lot of water, that operator would stay until the tower's full. If he had to stay until 11 o'clock at night, he'd make sure that the tower's full before he goes home.
What is the inside of the water tower made of? Like, what kind of material?
It's metal. It does rust occasionally. Every now and then you have to have a tank cleaned. But what we do, we have a cathodic protection. It's basically electrical current that I really don't know how it works. It's kind of like above my head, but it keeps the water from getting corrosive, or it'll fight the corrosiveness of the water. So that actually helps the length of the time that the tank can be in service before it has to be cleaned of, you know, rust or sediment. Well, this right here on top of the, if you look down in, well, you can't really see it today. Usually when the sun comes in through the windows, you can actually see the filter bed, they call it. It's actually the bed of sand and anthracite and gravel, but I'd say the bed from top to bottom is from the floor to maybe about here. And that's all that stuff, all that sand that the water goes through to filter the water before it gets down in that bottom well down there. So actually, this water's been settled, but it has not been filtered yet. But on the bottom, all that media, that's been filtered water. That water you can actually drink. I wouldn't want to drink this water.